Every story that you have ever heard has and demonstrates a worldview, a way of seeing. We often don't pay attention to this worldview or what it says about the world, about us, or our place in the world. We give little thought to the convictions behind the way the story unfolds. Now, Tolkien describes his masterpiece, The Lord of the Rings, as a thoroughly Catholic work, making it explicitly Christian. And yet most people who read or watch the story never really realize this. So today I want to ask one simple question. What does it mean for a story outside of the Bible that has never mentioned Christ to be a Christian story? A couple of years ago, I watched a video from Mike Jones at Inspiring Philosophy, where he did a great job comparing the Rings of Power show on Amazon to Game of Thrones. And his main comment was that despite the fact that Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones have nothing really in common, or, well, I'll spend the next few episodes actually talking about that exact question, do they? But despite the fact that they come from very different perspectives and worldviews, Rings of Power and Game of Thrones operate with very similar worldviews, and he discusses why that happens. And it really got my wheels turning. So I've spent literally the last few years thinking about that question, and I've wanted to make this series many, many times over the span of those 2 years, and just haven't been able to get around to it for a variety of reasons. So now I've come to it. I'm going to spend some time first today talking about Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, and then in the future we're going to get to some comparison between Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings and what that means for Christian thought in general. So I have two main objectives over the course of the next few episodes. So the first is to examine the way that stories operate as a basis for specific worldviews and how those ways of seeing inform more than just our engagement with the story, but how we are shaped as people because of our engagement with the story. And so I want us to think carefully and attentively about the way that stories present to us ideas, philosophies that we can live into, beyond just ideas that we think, but ways that we be. And then I want to take it a step further and apply this to the Bible. My hope is that by using a secular, Tolkien's not really secular, but by using a less dogmatically constrained example, Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones versus the Bible and something, which we'll get to, that I can demonstrate the way that this works and the way it works its way out in a somewhat low stakes kind of environment, that we can then turn back to Scripture and re-engage with a new set of principles and a new orientation, kind of fine-tuned to certain things. So that is the objective. We'll see how I do. How about that? Hold me accountable. So one of the things that I want to talk about primarily and first is Tolkien's Christian imagination. Now, mission statement, revisiting time, Belfast Podcast, our goal here is to recapture the Christian imagination. So in me saying this, I'm already kind of signaling that I think Tolkien's getting something right about what it means to have a Christian imagination. But there's a really interesting quote. I'm going to be referencing a lot of Peter Kraft here in preparing for this. I read his book on Tolkien's philosophy, a couple of other works on Tolkien's thought. And he has a great quote where he talks about something that Flannery O'Connor says about what it is to be a Christian novel. Flannery O'Connor defines the Christian novel not as a novel about Christianity, Christians, or a Christian world, but one in which the truth as Christians know it has been used as a light to see the world by. Light looking along instead of looking at. I will reference that again because that's a reference to C.S. Lewis, but that's a ways off. What Kraft is saying, that O'Connor is saying, is that a Christian novel is not a novel, a Christian work of art is not a work of art about Christ. It's one that exists in the light of Christ. It's one that exists, and its existence is contingent upon the reality of Christian truths. And that's important. So, Tolkien creates the Lord of the Rings in an attempt to let the light of Christ shine through the story. And so, this is, not groundbreaking. No one's going to be shocked by this unless you haven't really been paying attention. Aragorn, Gandalf, and Frodo, and to a certain degree Sam, all kind of encompass certain valences of what it means to be like Christ. They're all Christ figures in some sense. Aragorn, the king who returns, so a kind of eschatological end times valence going on. King who's gone and comes back. Gandalf, death and resurrection, that one's pretty obvious. And then Frodo, the suffering servant who carries the sins of the people to their ultimate destruction, and kind of to his own. All of these things are expressions in some way of what it means to follow Christ, to be a Christian, to be like Christ, to be Christ. That's what Christ was, in some sense. The culmination of all of those things, and more. And so, Kraft says, Tolkien uses what he calls the fairy story to resist the modern impulse to reject the old outright with preference for the new and scientifically good. So Tolkien's doing a little bit more than just trying to create a Christian story. He's trying to create a story around which the times that we're in and the way that those times have moved past certain things get called into question. So that was a paraphrase of Kraft from his book. He also, and he goes on to explain that traditional wisdom, and that's really one of the things that Tolkien's focusing on here, is the way that traditional wisdom, and a slow and steady pace instead of a quick mechanical rush help us encounter the world in a way that is salvific. And so he says that traditional wisdom is not blind, is not a blind and rampant innovation. It resists this tendency to want to rush to the next thing that's so much characteristic of our world now, even more so than it was of Tolkien's. And so but he doesn't blindly follow tradition either. And so he has a balance, a way of engaging both tradition, but also the need to aim tradition at a good and bright future. And so Tolkien's doing multiple things at the same time. He's stacking on a implicitly Christian structure to the story and the way his characters operate. But then he's also wanting us to kind of step on the brakes at least a little bit when it comes to blindly rushing into the next new and greatest thing. So those are two of Tolkien's main emphases. Now, his story operates within a particular kind of literature that Tolkien coins a term for. He calls the way his story unfolds a eucatastrophe. Now, a eucatastrophe, it's the combination of two words. The Greek eu, which means good, actually is the first part of the Greek word for gospel, good news, eu, and catastrophe, some kind of horrible thing. And so, he's literally coining a term, the good catastrophe. He defines eucatastrophe as a good catastrophe. It is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure, something genuinely bad. The possibility of these eucatastrophes, or of these discatastrophes, is necessary to the joy of deliverance. So if deliverance is going to be real, the possibility of a genuine bad, of a genuine negative outcome needs to be real. But eucatastrophe, it denies universal final defeat, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. He goes on to describe this joy of the eucatastrophe as mixing sorrow and joy together. But he says something to the effect of like selfishness and altruism get melded together in love. Very poetic way of speaking. It's quite beautiful. But this concept of the eucatastrophe is, for Tolkien, central to what it means to have a Christian story, a genuine story, a story that hurts in a good way. A story like the crucifixion. I think that's some of where he's pulling this from. Eucatastrophe is, in some sense, the opposite of a tragedy. Something where all of the characters do the right thing and a bad outcome still takes hold in the end. So Tolkien chooses the term eucatastrophe to emphasize that the sudden turning or unexpected deliverance at the end of a true tale of fairy. He coins another term, a fairy story. It's a story that is in some sense it uses a mythical way of being, but it's not just a child's tale. It depicts some truth about the world. A story of Faerie must be experienced not as an achievement of triumphant revenge, but rather as a divine gift. So the eucatastrophe, another important part of the definition that I just read, is that it's a grace. It's given to you. And you can't count on it to recur again, because it's not something that you can repeat. It's not something that you can control, an important thing we'll get into later. It's something that is given to you beyond yourself, beyond your capacities. The joy produced by such a happy ending requires a surprise, a deliverance that no human effort could have made possible, a grace, quite literally. That's a quote from another book, Lord of the Rings and Philosophy. So, in a real sense, the story points beyond itself to an eternal and eschatological hope beyond all darkness. It is a reaching out to something that transcends it. And that's really what Tolkien, intends with his story. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's centrally Christian, because it has a telos, a goal, a purpose that is beyond not just the story, but the story itself. Even within the story, there is a goal that's beyond the things that are happening in it. It encompasses these many ways of being Christian. This good tragedy, eucatastrophe, this, and all of these Christian elements get pulled in and really embodied in the story itself. So Tolkien, like Lewis, as we've covered, thought that a fairy story was more than an invented story or an old wives' tale to entertain young children. It was a serious literary art that depicts a magical world and deals with real world challenges. And so it's not it deals with real world challenges, but also things that are deeply human, and helps us realize things about ourselves that we hadn't realized before. It lets us see ourselves in a new light. It is really, in some sense, a mirror to us. So, that's a little bit about why or how Tolkien's story operates as a Christian story. I want to get a little bit more specific. Tolkien's criticized quite a lot about the way he depicts good and evil. He's accused a lot of times, and we're going to hit this relatively quickly. He's accused of being simplistic because of the exclusivity of good and evil. There isn't this moral gray where you wrestle with ambiguities of morality. And so Tolkien himself, in one of his letters, says that, "In my story, I do not deal with absolute evil. I do not think there is such a thing, since that is zero." It's a really interesting quote. So to understand why, I'm going to argue that Tolkien's depiction of good and evil is not just not simplistic, but is realistic. I want us to pick apart this quote and some implications. So he says, "In my story, I don't deal with absolute evil." Okay, so absolute good, absolute evil as these distinct categories that are warring against each other. Some kind of yin-yang, although yin-yang is a little bit more complicated than that. A dark, light, not just exclusivity, but their being, their ontology, their existence is equal. He's saying that's not a thing. That's not real. He doesn't think in our world, and it's definitely not real in the world that he created, Middle Earth. "I do not think there is such a thing," he continues, "since that is zero." Now, it's interesting. He equates evil with zero. I think here is where he's dealing with, again, Christian categories. So he is, I think, relying on a doctrine from St. Augustine on evil, sometimes phrased as evil is perversion or privation. What this means is St. Augustine thought that evil is either a perversion, a twisting of something that is genuinely good towards improper goals or improper ends, using something improperly, taking, a classic example would be you can use a sword to protect, or you can use a sword to do horrible, unspeakable things. That's something that happens in The Lord of the Rings. You pervert a good thing towards something that's evil. Or privation is his other thing, the other way that he sees evil operating. Privation is the withholding of something that is good, that's genuinely good. And so the lack of a good then becomes an evil. And so Augustine thinks that evil isn't a thing in itself. It is only ever good things twisted or withheld. And that is a very distinct way of considering what it is for something to be evil. Instead of being a substance, a real substance, Augustine's conviction is that everything that exists is good. Everything. but it can be used in improper ways. So, food is a good that we need. In fact, the withholding of food for too long is an evil. The withholding of it intentionally for a certain period of time is fasting, and that is a spiritual good. But withholding it for too long to the point of starvation is an evil. Sex is a good. Something that, if aimed in the right direction with the right restraints, produces a good. But it also has inherent within it, maybe not inherent within it, but inherent in the way that we can twist it and use it for our own self-gratification beyond normal constraints, it becomes an evil. So, pornography as a good example. So, for Augustine and for Tolkien, there is no such thing as absolute evil. Now, you'd think, he's got the classic Dark Lord and the gross monsters who are just gross monsters. How can you really say that Tolkien doesn't believe in it, in some sense, an absolute evil? I'm going to take a quote from The Lord of the Rings. This is from the Fellowship of the Ring. It's Elrond talking. So, as Elrond says, nothing is evil in the beginning. Even Sauron was not so. It's interesting. The Dark Lord himself was not evil in the beginning. And he isn't even the biggest Dark Lord, interestingly enough. There's Morgoth above him, who also was created as an angel. I believe he's one of the Valar, who starts to sing a different song. We'll get into this in a little while, a few episodes. And so the surface level read of Tolkien's story, that there's a simplistic good and a simplistic evil, and these things, they're mutually exclusive, for one, and mutually exclusive as far as embodied persons. That is false. But he does believe in the exclusivity of good and evil. We'll get into that in a little bit. Now, I'm going to play a clip from the episode that Mike Jones did on, he's talking about Rings of Power and Game of Thrones, but it deals with some relevant things from Tolkien's philosophy. And so I want us to take a look at this.
This world is a struggle between good and evil, but there's always a clear good side and a clear dark side. There's never a point the reader is supposed to get the idea we don't know who is good and who is evil. Goodness for Tolkien is always acting in love and following the plan of God. The only characters who struggle to identify what is good are those who are tempted by evil or succumb to it. One doesn't need to touch the darkness to know what goodness is, because for Tolkien, evil is the perversion of goodness. Later in the show, Halbrand tells Galadriel that he has done many evil things.
So, just real quick, I may return to some of what he says right there, but he says it exactly as I said it, that evil is the perversion, exactly as Tolkien says it, really. Evil is the perversion of good things. Now, the way Mike frames it there, I'd want to be a little bit more careful. I think it's accurate to say that good and evil are exclusive in Tolkien's world. But that's not to say that the good side and the evil side are exclusive. There are many characters with righteous intentions and moral justifications that do evil. And so, evil and good are opposites that never cross streams for Tolkien. But there's no such thing as an absolutely evil person. There's no such thing as an absolutely good person. Someone who never does evil, someone who never does good. People bounce across the good-evil line all the time in The Lord of the Rings. The reason I think that we bristle a little bit at Tolkien's moral rigidity, one, is the way that we're enculturated. We want some kind of moral flexibility in order, I think, to justify ourselves. So there's that. But it's also because it's a difficult standard that few people can accomplish. And so we genuinely don't, because most of us can't accomplish the goal that Tolkien sets out for us. None of us can, actually. That's his conviction. None of us can accomplish the goal that Tolkien sets out for us. We feel inadequate and threatened. And I think that's one of the reasons why we resist his call to us as moral simplicity. So, another quote from Peter Kraft. He says, Tolkien certainly believes in the goodness and badness and of badness. He is not a moral relativist, but that does not make him a legalist or a fundamentalist. A common but indefensible error of some critics is to see The Lord of the Rings as morally simplistic, as a white versus black, good guy versus bad guy story. This is so far from the truth as to be literally absurd. I'll say that again. Kraft says this is so far from the truth as to be literally absurd. With the exception of Tom Bombadil, there is hardly a character in The Lord of the Rings who is not tempted by evil. The war is not just external, between the white chess pieces and the black, but within every single piece on the board. Even while there is an external war going on between two sides that are really, but imperfectly, representing the good, the fellowship, and the evil, Mordor. Notice, there's an external war going on between two sides that really do represent good versus evil, but they do so imperfectly. And while this external war is going on, there's a war going on inside every single character. Is Aragorn going to become the king that he's meant to be, or is he going to falter? Is Frodo going to be able to carry the ring and complete his quest, or is he going to try and take it and seize power for himself? These are the questions, and many more. Is Boromir going to succumb to the temptation? Is Gollum? And so it's a story happening morally on two planes. And a lot of people see ugly orcs versus pretty elves and humans and think that it's morally simplistic when they don't really see what's going on beneath the surface. Kraft continues. Tolkien is not a psychological absolutist, meaning he doesn't think that psychologically in our heads we are either all good or all evil, or there's an absolute evil or absolute good inside of us. Tolkien is not a psychological absolutist, but a moral absolutist. So what he's saying is the truth of goodness and the truth of badness are real. But we don't fall neatly into any of those categories. No person, he continues, is absolutely good or evil, but goodness and evil themselves are absolutely distinct. He believes that there is a little good in the worst of us and a little bad in the best of us, but not that there's a little good in evil and a little evil in good. And so that is, I think, the distinguishing mark of what it means for Tolkien that we are, or that his story is, a morally real story. And for him, as we will see, goodness requires a submission to something beyond the self. Something that is instead of a Nietzschean desire to grab, to take, to hold, to wield, to master, to overpower. Boromir is a shining and strong hero, and I think we oftentimes cut Boromir short. He is supposed to represent the best of us. He's Gondor's best hero. There's a reason his father likes him the most. And yet, because he wants to take, because he wants to seize what isn't good and what isn't his to wield for a good purpose, the defense of his people, who have been suffering in the defense of the entire people of Middle-earth. Right? That's what he's trying to do. Like, it's a good thing. But he still falters. And so his fall, I think, demonstrates most poignantly the thing that Tolkien's trying to say, at least when it comes to moral exclusivity and the penetration of good and evil into every human heart. So, and this will take it like a brief step further. Another quote from Kraft on, because again, a lot of people, they look at the mythology and they say, you've got elves who are pretty and goblins who are ugly, and the goblins and the orcs who are ugly, they're bad, and the elves who are pretty are good. Therefore, it's morally simplistic. Kraft points out, this is kind of following his quotation of Elrond that I quoted earlier. Nothing is evil in the beginning, or by nature. Morgoth, Melkor, who was the original Dark Lord, was one of the Ainur. That's what it was. Sauron was a Maya. This is a little bit, so you've got a whole mythology going on here, and the Ainur are the like archangels, and then the Maya are these like lower spirit beings. Saruman was the head of Gandalf's order of wizards, right? So you've got the big bad, Morgoth, who was originally a good thing, turns bad. Sauron, who was originally created as basically an angel, both of them were, turns bad. Saruman, head of Gandalf's order and is also kind of a spiritual being, turns bad. Orcs, the orcs were elves. The ring wraiths were great men. Gollum was a hobbit. He points all of this out to make the point that all of these things in Middle-earth were once good things. But those good things have gone astray. They've sought after things that twisted them, that distorted them. Back to Augustine's point, right? Perversion. It twists. And when you twist yourself, what Tolkien does that's really clever is he doesn't just leave that twist on the inside. That twist begins to manifest itself on the outside too. They have rejected the order of goodness for which they were created, and thus have become empty shells and shallow reflections of the things they were in the beginning. They're no longer the good that they once were. And that is exactly Tolkien's point. And so, talking about Lord of the Rings being a Christian story, I think, is to fully reckon with that reality. I want to play one more clip by a YouTuber called Hello Future Me. He does some really interesting story stuff, or at least did. I haven't honestly watched his stuff in quite some time, but he has another Tolkien philosophy video that I think is helpful when it comes to thinking about Tolkien and evil. So I'll let him talk for us.
But Tolkien's rejection of the Paragon goes even deeper than this. He goes on to say that I do not think that Frodo's failure was a moral failure. Moral failure can only be asserted, I think, when a man's effort or endurance falls short of his limits, and the blame decreases as that limit is closer approached. It is no more a moral failure than the breaking of his body would have been. Say, Frodo was crushed by a falling rock. We repeatedly see throughout the story characters interacting with the One Ring, some falling to it, some resisting it. There's tension because there is an ambiguity as to whether Frodo will be able to resist the One Ring in the end. After all, he's had it for a lot longer than most of these characters who have only interacted with it pretty briefly overall, and the one character who has interacted with it for an extended period of time, or the two if we include Bilbo, they're, well, the tension in the narrative feels like it's leading to a moment where someone is going to have to resist the evil of the One Ring once and for all to destroy it. And it does. But instead of Tolkien telling the reader that we should always be like Frodo and resist the temptation of evil as he casts the ring into the fires, Tolkien instead chooses to acknowledge our inherent flaws as humans. This is because Tolkien believes that there are some situations in which it is impossible for us to be truly moral, some moments that are just beyond us. Interestingly, this seems to be a subjective standard, that we all have different moral limits. And if we read this as kind of influenced or inspired by his experiences in war, it's understandable to see where this idea comes from. The idea that you can always and truly act morally when you're put in a stressful situation like a battlefield in World War I, it's understandable that in real life there may be situations where acting morally is just beyond us. What matters to Tolkien is that we strive to reach that moral limit, and that struggle itself is moral.
So, that's a really, really important part of the puzzle that I think almost everyone overlooks when it comes to the moral landscape that is the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's insistence that Frodo's failure was not a moral failure because he reached the end of his moral willpower and didn't have any more to give, and that, as Hello Future Me says, Tolkien recognizes that you can be boxed in. The man who fought in World War I recognizes that you can be boxed in to situations where there is no good moral way out. The whole story of Lord of the Rings is trying to demonstrate that at a certain point in time, you cannot do good naturally anymore. We get into particular situations where there is no good option, where the situation just becomes beyond us. And I think we need to remember that as we move forward. So in wrapping up, I want us to remember Tolkien's story is a genuinely Christian story. It's morally exclusive, but not morally simplistic, and that part of this moral sophistication is that we can reach the end of our moral limits. Tolkien always thinks that no matter... a lot of people think, that Tolkien thinks that no matter the situation, you can always do what's good. But that's not what Tolkien thinks at all. For Tolkien, sometimes the particulars of a situation are beyond our finite capacities as creatures, and that we get boxed out of ways that we can behave morally and thus need to be saved. And that is precisely the point of grace of the eucatastrophe. The solution is not to be a hero for Tolkien, not to rise up in your strength and triumph, but to sacrificially and humbly resist evil, relying on something that is beyond you, for Tolkien, God, that will ultimately save you from the darkness that is done to you and that you do. That is what it means to paint a Christian story.